Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton saw the mirage before the mirage saw him. It was the afternoon of the 1st of May, 1982, and he was flying an aircraft that most of the experts back in London had already decided could not do the thing he was about to attempt. His machine was subsonic. The two fighters climbing toward him out of the west could fly at more than twice the speed of sound. On paper, the contest was already over. On paper, Barton was flying a compromise, a political leftover, a naval afterthought that had reached the South Atlantic only because a string of accountants had failed to kill it in time. He was high above the cold grey water of the South Atlantic, west of a task force of ships that had no business being that far from home. Behind him, more than 12,000 kilometers behind him, lay Britain. Beneath him were two aircraft carriers that the Royal Navy had spent a decade pretending were not aircraft carriers at all. And ahead of him, closing fast, were the Mirage 3 fighters of the Argentine Air Force, the pride of a supersonic fleet, flown by men who had every reason to believe the slow British jump jets were dead the moment they left the deck. There is a detail about Paul Barton that captures the strangeness of the whole situation. He was not even a naval aviator by trade. He was a Royal Air Force pilot, on attachment to a Royal Navy squadron, flying a Royal Navy jet from a ship, in a war nobody had planned for, in an aircraft his own government had recently tried to sell. He belonged to 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Invincible, and on that first day of May he was one of a tiny handful of men who would have to prove, in the space of a few seconds, whether 16 years of official doubt had been right all along. The controller aboard Invincible had vectored Barton and his wingman toward the incoming raid. The radar contacts were real. This was not a drill. It was not an exercise over Malta or the North Sea. It was not a mock engagement against friendly fighters on a training range. This was the first time in history that the Sea Harrier would be asked to fight for its life. And the entire theory of the aircraft, everything its designers had promised, and everything its critics had sneered at, was about to be decided by one man, one missile, and one decision made at closing speeds that left almost no time to think. Barton rolled in. Below him, a nation that had nearly thrown this aircraft away was waiting to find out whether it had made a catastrophic mistake. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. Cold War Impact is an independent channel, and lately the numbers have been working against us. Views are down, the reach has narrowed, and videos like this one live or die on whether people take a few seconds to engage with them. If you appreciate deeply researched military history that treats you like an adult and gets the facts right, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it. Every single interaction tells the algorithm that this work is worth showing to others, and it is the one thing that lets me keep making documentaries at this depth. Thank you. Now let us go back and understand how Britain ended up defending its fleet with an aircraft the world had already written off. The weapon that would rewrite the rules of naval air warfare in 1982 was not a secret prototype. It was not a breakthrough that arrived just in time. It was an aircraft that Britain had spent 16 years trying not to build, then trying not to buy, then trying to sell to somebody else. The story of how a subsonic jump jet came to hold a 20-0 record against a supersonic air force does not begin over the Falklands. It begins in a set of government offices in London in the middle of the 1960s, where a generation of defence planners decided that the age of the British aircraft carrier was over, and very nearly took naval aviation down with it. To understand what Paul Barton was flying that afternoon and why it should not have been there at all, we have to go back to a decision made with a pen, years before anyone imagined a war in the South Atlantic. But first we need to understand the enemy and the threat, because the reason the whole world expected the Sea Harrier to fail was not irrational. It rested on hard evidence. The Argentine air arm was not a paper tiger. It was a real, modern, and genuinely dangerous force. And in the opening weeks of the war, it proved exactly how dangerous by doing the thing the British feared most. It began sinking ships. On the 4th of May, 1982, 3 days after Barton's first engagement, 2 Argentine Navy Superétendard strike jets lifted off from a mainland base and turned out over the ocean. Each carried a single French-built Exocet, a sea-skimming anti-ship missile that flew just above the wavetops at close to the speed of sound and was almost impossible to see coming. Their target was the British task force. Flying low to stay beneath the radar horizon, the 2 jets popped up for a few seconds to find their targets, launched, and turned for home without ever entering visual range. One of those missiles found HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer on picket duty. the Exocet struck the ship. Whether its warhead fully detonated is still debated to this day, but it did not matter. The impact and the burning rocket fuel started fires that spread faster than the crew could fight them, cutting the water main and filling the compartments with thick, choking smoke. 20 men were killed, Sheffield was abandoned, taken under tow in a bid to save her, and finally sank on the 10th of May. She was the first Royal Navy ship lost to enemy action since the Second World War, and she had been killed by an aircraft that never even had to fight, by a weapon launched from beyond the range at which anyone could stop it. That was the threat. That was what the Sea Harriers existed to blunt, because the only way to stop an Exocet was to shoot down the aircraft carrying it before it could launch, and the only aircraft the British had that could do that were the Sea Harriers, and Sheffield was only the beginning. When British troops went ashore at San Carlos Water on the 21st of May, the Argentine pilots came for the fleet in force, screaming in at mast height through a narrow stretch of water the sailors quickly named Bomb Alley. The frigate HMS Ardent was hit again and again by skyhawks and daggers and went down on the 21st, with the loss of 22 of her crew. HMS Antelope was struck by bombs that punched into her hull but failed to explode, and when a disposal team tried to defuse one of them, it detonated, killing an engineer, breaking the ship's back, and sending her to the bottom on the 24th in a photograph that traveled around the world, her wrecked superstructure wreathed in flame against the darkening sky. On the 25th of May, Argentina's National Day, the pilots flew with particular determination. The destroyer HMS Coventry, working as a radar picket to draw the raids away from the landing area, was overwhelmed by a wave of skyhawks. 3 bombs struck home, and the ship capsized within about 20 minutes, taking 19 men with her. That same day, a second pair of superétendards launched an Exocet that locked onto the Atlantic Conveyor, a requisitioned merchant ship that had ferried aircraft and supplies south. The missile struck, the ship caught fire, and she was lost along with 3 Chinook and several Wessex helicopters that the ground forces were counting on. Her loss meant that when the British infantry advanced on Port Stanley, most of them would have to cross the cold, wet, mountainous ground of East Falkland on foot, carrying their equipment on their backs, an ordeal the troops grimly called yomping. And then, on the 8th of June, came the worst single day for British ground forces. At Bluff Cove, on the southern approach to Stanley, the landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram lay in open water, still loaded with troops, waiting to disembark. A delay in getting the men ashore left them exposed. Argentine skyhawks caught them in the open. The bombs went into Sir Galahad and turned her into a burning wreck. 48 men were killed, 32 of them Welsh guards, and many of the survivors were seriously wounded. The images from Bluff Cove became some of the most painful of the entire conflict. One fact here is too often left out, because it cuts against the neat legend. The British were, in a sense, lucky, and they knew it. A large number of the bombs the Argentine pilots dropped on British ships in those confined waters failed to explode. To slip past the Sea Harriers and the ship's own missiles, the Argentine attack pilots came in extremely low and extremely fast, and dropping bombs from that height gave the weapons no time to arm themselves before impact. Bombs passed clean through ships without going off. Others lodged in hulls and simply sat there, unexploded. Had a larger share of those bombs detonated as designed, the British could have lost far more ships than they did, perhaps enough to lose the war. This does not shrink the Sea Harriers' achievement. It sharpens it. The pilots pressing those attacks so low that their bombs would not arm were flying that low precisely because of the threat in the sky above them. The Argentine airmen were being forced into a corner, and the corner was the Sea Harrier. This is the record of what the Argentine air arm could do, and it matters, because it demolishes the comfortable myth that the Sea Harrier faced a hopeless or incompetent enemy. The men flying those skyhawks and daggers and mirages were brave, skilled, and determined. They pressed their attacks through anti-aircraft fire and missiles at ranges that gave them almost no margin for error, flying to the outer edge of their fuel and often beyond the point of safe return. They sank warships of a first-rate navy. Every time a British ship burned, it was proof that the threat was real, and that the thin screen of Sea Harriers, standing between the fleet and disaster, was the only thing preventing something far worse. The question was never whether the Argentines could fight. They could. The question was whether a subsonic jump jet could stop them before they reached the ships. And to appreciate why almost no one believed it could, you have to look at what the Argentines were flying and at the men who flew it. The air war was fought against an Argentine fleet that, on paper, outclassed the Sea Harrier in nearly every category that traditional analysts cared about. The backbone of the Argentine air superiority force was the Mirage 3 of Grupo 8, a French-designed interceptor capable of Mach 2.2, more than twice the top speed of the Sea Harrier, a delta-wing thoroughbred built to climb high and fly fast. Alongside it flew the Israeli-built Dagger of Grupo 6, a version of the Mirage 5, rugged, quick, and supplied in useful numbers, flown mainly in the ground attack and anti-ship role. There were around 50 Skyhawks, American-built attack jets flown by Grupo 4 and Grupo 5, and by the Argentine Navy, subsonic but nimble, reliable, and pressed home with tremendous aggression. There were the 5 super-etendards of the Navy with their air-launched exocets, the aircraft that had already shown they could kill a destroyer from beyond the horizon. There were Canberra bombers, propeller-driven Pucara attack aircraft operating from the islands themselves, and the transports that kept the garrison supplied. Altogether, Argentina could field well over 100 combat aircraft, and against them the Royal Navy had, at the start, just 20 Sea Harriers. Before the war was over, 28 Sea Harriers would serve in total, flown by fewer than 30 combat pilots. Set against a combat air fleet of more than 100 machines, the British fighters were outnumbered by roughly 5-1. Argentina even had its own aircraft carrier, the 25 de Mayo, named for the country's national day. Early in the conflict, the Argentine Navy planned to use her to launch a strike by her own Skyhawks against the British task force. On the day the strike was planned, the winds were too light for the heavily loaded jets to get airborne from her deck, and the attack was cancelled. Then, on the 2nd of May, the British submarine Conqueror torpedoed and sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano with heavy loss of life. The effect on the Argentine Navy was immediate and total. Fearing the British submarines, the entire Argentine surface fleet, the carrier included, withdrew to coastal waters and took almost no further part in the war. This mattered enormously because it meant that from early May onward, every Argentine air attack had to be flown from bases on the mainland, hundreds of kilometers from the fight. The geography that would finally doom the Argentine air effort was set in place by a single torpedo attack, and it is impossible to tell the story of the Sea Harrier's success without it. Consider the confidence the Argentine command still carried. Their pilots had trained for years on fast jets built to intercept and to strike. The Mirage had a distinguished pedigree, a type that had shot down enemy aircraft in numbers in the Middle East. Argentine airmen looked at the British force and saw a handful of slow, stubby vertical takeoff jets flying from 2 undersized carriers, with no airborne early warning aircraft to guide them, no aerial tankers to stretch their patrols, and no friendly airfield within thousands of kilometers if anything went wrong. Everything the Argentines had been taught about air combat told them that speed was survival, that a fighter which could not go supersonic was a fighter that would die. They were not fools for thinking this. It was the conventional wisdom of every major air force on Earth. The United States, the Soviet Union, France, all of them were pouring money into ever faster interceptors. The whole logic of the jet age said, the fast aircraft wins. And Argentine doctrine was built on that logic and on mass, the same instinct that has driven aggressive air forces for generations. Get your fast aircraft over the target, strike hard, and be gone before the enemy can bring anything capable of stopping you to bear. Against a defending force of 20 subsonic jets, the Argentine planners had every statistical reason to believe it would work. What they did not fully reckon with, what almost no one reckoned with, was that the map hid a problem, and that the slow British jet carried something that made speed almost meaningless. But before we reach that, we have to return to London, and to the long, strange story of how Britain nearly guaranteed that no Sea Harrier would ever fly from a carrier at all. The jump jet had begun as one of the boldest ideas in aviation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the British firm Hawker developed an experimental aircraft called the P-1127, powered by a revolutionary Rolls-Royce engine whose exhaust could be redirected downward through swiveling nozzles, letting the aircraft take off vertically, hover, and then move into normal flight. It was a genuine leap, a fixed wingjet that needed no runway. The P-1127 and the evaluation aircraft that followed it proved the concept worked. The natural next step was a supersonic version, a jump jet that could also break the sound barrier, and that aircraft was designed as the P-1154. It promised the best of both worlds, vertical takeoff and supersonic speed. In 1965, the British government cancelled the P-1154, It was ambitious, it was expensive, and in the budget-cutting mood of the middle 1960s, it was killed. In its place, the Royal Air Force would eventually accept the more modest subsonic aircraft developed straight from the earlier design. That aircraft became the Harrier. It could hover, it could take off from a clearing or a road or the deck of a small ship, and it could fly and fight at low level with real effect, but it could not go supersonic, and in the eyes of many, that one limitation defined it forever as second best, the machine Britain built, because it could not afford the machine it actually wanted. Then came the blow that nearly ended British naval aviation altogether. In the Defence Review of 1966, the government cancelled a planned new class of large fleet aircraft carriers, known by the designation CVA-01, that were meant to replace the aging carriers of the wartime generation. These were to have been proper carriers, big ships able to operate fast conventional jets with catapults and arrestor wires. Their cancellation was a deliberate strategic choice, driven by cost, and by a judgment that Britain would pull back from many of its global commitments and that the era of the large British carrier was finished. The Royal Navy was, in effect, told that when its remaining old carriers wore out, they would not be replaced, and the fast jets of the fleet would go with them. It was one of the most consequential defence decisions in British post-war history, and the government even turned down an American offer to sell or lend surplus carriers, so determined was it to leave the carrier business for good. But the Navy did not simply accept the death of carrier aviation. What followed was a quiet act of institutional survival that borders on the ingenious. The Royal Navy needed ships to command anti-submarine task forces in the North Atlantic against the growing Soviet submarine threat, ships that could carry helicopters and serve as floating headquarters. So it designed exactly such a ship, and it very carefully did not call it an aircraft carrier. It called it a through-deck cruiser. The name was a deliberate piece of political camouflage, chosen to avoid the toxic word carrier so soon after the government had sworn off them. These new vessels, the Invincible class, were presented as anti-submarine cruisers built to hunt Soviet submarines. But their design left open a possibility that the planners quietly nurtured. With their long, clear flight decks, they could, if anyone chose to, operate a small number of vertical takeoff jets. That was the loophole. That was the crack through which naval fixed-wing aviation survived. The subsonic Harrier, the compromise aircraft born from the ashes of the cancelled supersonic dream, was the only fighter that could fly from these disguised carriers, because it needed no catapult and no arrestor wire. It could take off in a short run and land vertically. A navalized version was developed, the Sea Harrier FRS-1, the letters standing for Fighter, Reconnaissance and Strike, fitted with a Blue Fox radar in a hinged nose and armed with two 30mm cannon and air-to-air missiles. It entered service in 1980, just 2 years before the war, an aircraft so new that when the fighting began, some of its weapons had not yet finished their trials. There was one more piece of British ingenuity that made the whole thing work, and it is worth pausing on, because it is such an elegant solution. A vertical takeoff burns enormous amounts of fuel and limits the weight an aircraft can lift. But a Royal Navy officer, Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor, had worked out that if you angled the end of the flight deck upward into a curved ramp, the aircraft could roll forward, hit the ramp, and be flung into the air on a rising path, gaining precious seconds of flight while it built up to proper flying speed. This let the Sea Harrier take off with far more fuel and weapons than a flat deck would ever have allowed. The curved ramp became known as the ski jump, and it was fitted to the carriers, angled at 12 degrees on Hermes and 7 degrees on Invincible. It was clever, it was economical, and to a great many defense analysts, it was still, frankly, a joke. A subsonic fighter, flung off a ramp on the bow of a cruiser pretending to be a carrier, defended by a navy that the government had spent 15 years trying to force out of the carrier business. The professional consensus held that if these aircraft ever met a real air force, the losses would be severe. Even inside the British establishment, some officials privately expected Sea Harrier casualties in a real war to be heavy. And here is the detail that makes the whole story almost unbearable in hindsight. In 1981, the year before the war, the British government carried out a defence review under the Defence Secretary John Nott. The review called for deep cuts to the surface fleet, on the belief that the Navy's future lay in submarines and that large surface ships were a luxury Britain could not afford. Among its decisions, the government agreed to sell HMS Invincible, one of the two carriers that would soon carry the Sea Harriers into battle, to Australia. The sale was arranged and announced. The ship that would launch Paul Barton and his squadron toward the Argentine Mirages had months earlier already been signed away to a foreign navy. The weapon that would save the fleet was not merely underestimated, it was being actively disposed of. The answer to the coming crisis was, in the most literal sense, on its way out the door. And then, on the 2nd of April, 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands, and everything changed overnight. The sale of Invincible was cancelled. Within days, a task force was assembled and sent racing south. The through-deck cruisers sailed to war as the aircraft carriers everyone had always known they were. And the subsonic jump jet that Britain had tried so hard to avoid building, buying and keeping was suddenly the only shield the fleet had. 20 Sea Harriers sailed south in early April aboard Hermes and Invincible, and everything the British effort depended upon, the landings, the fleet, the recapture of the islands, the lives of thousands of men, now rested on whether the aircraft the skeptics had written off could do what they had always sworn it could not. The scale of what Britain attempted in those first days is easy to forget now. Hermes and Invincible sailed from Portsmouth on the 5th of April, just 3 days after the invasion, cheered out of harbour by enormous crowds lining the shore, and then pointed their bows south toward a war on the far side of the planet. The voyage itself ran to weeks, and the whole way down the ground, crews and the pilots worked without rest to ready an aircraft that was still so new that some of its weapons had not yet been cleared for operational use. Trials that in peacetime would have taken months were compressed into the long passage south, carried out at sea, against the clock, in the sober knowledge that the first serious mistake would be discovered not on a range, but in combat. By the time the carriers reached the freezing waters off the Falklands, the Sea Harrier was as ready as improvisation and hard work could make it. And it was about to be tested against exactly the kind of enemy the Analysts had spent years insisting it could never survive. Now we come to the heart of it. To the reason the impossible turned out to be almost inevitable, provided a few conditions were met. Because the Sea Harrier's dominance was never really about the aircraft's speed, and it was never really about the famous trick that most people think won the war. It was about a missile, a fuel gauge, and a set of tactics that turned every Argentine advantage into a liability. Let us start with the myth, because it is worth clearing away. The Harrier is famous for a maneuver called viffing, from the phrase vectoring in forward flight. By swiveling the same engine nozzles that normally point down for hovering, a Harrier pilot could redirect thrust while flying level, causing the aircraft to slow violently or change its attitude in ways a conventional fighter could not match. In theory, this let the Harrier force a pursuer to overshoot, turning the hunter into the hunted. Viffing has become the centerpiece of the Sea Harrier legend, the secret move that supposedly let the slow British jet beat faster opponents in a swirling dogfight. The reality is more sober and, in a way, more impressive. The Falklands Air War was almost never a turning, twisting dogfight. Viffing was a useful trick in training, and it might, in principle, rescue a pilot in a desperate close-in fight, but the overwhelming majority of Sea Harrier kills were not won by outflying anyone. They were won by getting into position and firing a missile. The Sea Harrier did not need to be a better dogfighter than the Mirage. It simply never had to dogfight on the Mirage's terms. The real weapon was the Sidewinder, and specifically the version known as the AIM-9L, and to understand why it mattered so much, you have to understand what came before it. For decades, heat-seeking air-to-air missiles had a crippling limitation. They could only reliably track the hot exhaust of an enemy's engine, which meant they had to be fired from behind the target, into the rear hemisphere, after the attacker had already worked his way into a tail chase. Getting into that firing position against a capable enemy was the single hardest part of air combat, the thing that separated the aces from the dead. The AIM-9L changed the equation completely. It was an all-aspect missile. Its improved seeker could lock onto an enemy aircraft from the front, from the side, from head-on, from almost any angle at all. A Sea Harrier pilot no longer had to win a long maneuvering battle to get behind his opponent. He only had to point his aircraft in the general direction of the enemy, close to within range, listen for the electronic growl that told him the missile had found the target, and fire. One part of this story is usually passed over quickly in the British telling. Britain did not hold large stocks of the newest Sidewinder when the war began, and it was the United States that supplied them. Behind the scenes, American support for Britain during the conflict was substantial, and the American Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, made sure that Britain received advanced equipment, including the latest all-aspect Sidewinders, in time for them to be shipped south and fitted to the Sea Harriers. Of the roughly 20 Argentine aircraft that Sea Harriers destroyed in air-to-air combat, 16 were killed by that missile. The Argentines, by contrast, carried older weapons with the classic rear aspect limitation. Missiles that required them to get behind the Sea Harriers to have any chance, exactly the kind of extended maneuvering fight their fuel state would never allow. The missile did the work. The pilot's job was to survive long enough to bring it to bear. Now add the second factor, the one hiding on the map. With the Argentine carrier shut up in port, the fast jets could fly only from bases on the mainland, hundreds of kilometers from the islands. A Mirage or a Dagger or a Skyhawk making the long overwater flight arrived with only a few minutes of fuel to spare, in many cases just 5 to 10 minutes over the target area before it had to turn for home or risk falling into the sea on the way back. This one fact dismantled every theoretical advantage the Argentine fighters held. Speed is only an advantage if you can afford to spend it, and burning fuel at supersonic speeds across hundreds of kilometers of ocean was a luxury none of them had. Turning to dogfight, a Sea Harrier meant burning fuel a pilot did not have. Climbing to fight at altitude meant burning fuel. The Argentine jets were forced to come in low and fast, deliver their attack on the ships, and run, with no margin to stay and fight for control of the air. They could not linger, they could not maneuver freely, and they could not choose the terms of the engagement. The Sea Harriers, by contrast, were flying from carriers just off the coast. They could hold their patrols for long stretches. They were fighting in the center of their own performance envelope, at the low and medium heights, where the Harrier was most at home, and they had a controller and a radar picture behind them, even if that picture was far from perfect. That imperfection is worth naming honestly, because it was the Sea Harrier's greatest handicap, and it explains why so many raids got through. The British task force had no airborne early warning aircraft, no radar plane orbiting overhead to spot low-flying attackers while they were still far away. The ship's radars were blocked by the islands and confused by the terrain, so Argentine jets coming in low over the land could appear with very little warning. The Sea Harriers were, in effect, asked to guard a vast area of sky and sea while half-blind. The lesson was learned at bitter cost, and after the war Britain rushed a radar-equipped early warning version of the Sea King helicopter into service, so that no fleet would ever again go to war without eyes in the sky. That the Sea Harriers achieved what they did without that advantage makes the record more impressive, not less. And then add the third factor, the human one, because none of the technology would have counted for anything in the hands of poorly trained pilots. The Sea Harrier squadrons were small, tightly knit, and superbly prepared. In peacetime, Royal Navy Sea Harrier pilots had flown practice combat against some of the best fighters in the Western world, including American designs far faster than their own, and they had learned, again and again, how to fight a quicker opponent by refusing to play his game. They understood their aircraft's strengths at low altitude and low speed. They drilled the discipline of the single-pass intercept. Find the target, close to missile range, fire, and reset, rather than getting dragged into a long fight that favored no one. They flew constant patrols in appalling weather from pitching decks, launching into low cloud and driving rain, and recovering to a heaving flight deck with fuel running low and no alternative airfield anywhere on Earth. They did it day after day, sortie after sortie, with a professionalism that turned a tiny force into a wall. Put those three things together and the arithmetic reverses. The Argentine fighter that seemed twice as fast, twice as modern, and part of a force 5 times as large, arrived over the battle low on fuel, unable to maneuver freely, carrying an inferior missile, flown by a pilot who could not afford to fight, straight into the firing parameters of an all-aspect sidewinder carried by a patient, well-trained enemy who did not need to be faster to win. It was not a fair fight. It was a rout waiting to happen, provided the Sea Harrier pilots reached their positions, provided the controllers put them onto the raids in time, and provided the men in the cockpits kept their nerve when the moment came. On the 1st of May, 1982, the theory met reality for the first time, and the answer came in a matter of seconds. Return now to Paul Barton, rolling in above the South Atlantic, the whole unproven promise of the aircraft resting on his next decision. The war in the air had opened in the small hours of that same day with one of the most extraordinary missions in the history of aerial bombing. A single Royal Air Force Vulcan bomber, flying from Ascension Island roughly halfway between Britain and the Falklands, made an almost unbelievable round trip of many thousands of kilometers, refueled in the air again and again, by a fleet of aging tanker aircraft in a relay so complex it strained the entire force, in order to drop a stick of bombs across the runway at Port Stanley. The raid, codenamed Black Buck, cratered the runway, and just as importantly, it sent a message the Argentine command could not ignore. If British bombers could reach Stanley, they could in principle reach the Argentine mainland itself. That message would shape the whole air war within hours. In daylight on the 1st of May, Sea Harriers struck the airfields at Stanley and Goose Green. The Argentines, stung and now aware that the British carriers were within striking distance, launched a major coordinated response in the afternoon, sending waves of aircraft out toward the task force. Among them were the Mirage 3 fighters of Grupo 8, the finest air superiority machines Argentina owned, sent up specifically to sweep the British jets from the sky and clear the way for the bombers behind them. This was the moment the entire theory of the Sea Harrier would be tested, fighter against fighter, the supersonic Mirage against the subsonic jump jet, precisely the contest the Analysts had said Britain would lose. Barton and his wingman, Lieutenant Steve Thomas, were on patrol when the controller aboard the carrier called the contacts. 2 Mirages were coming in high and fast. The Sea Harriers were guided into position, and then it became a question of geometry and nerve. The Argentine pilots, committed to the intercept, could not afford a long fight this far from home. The 2 pairs of aircraft closed at a combined speed that ate up the distance between them in seconds. Barton worked for a firing position on one of the Mirages, brought his Sidewinder to bear, and waited for the tone that told him the missile's seeker had locked onto its target. When that tone came, he fired. The Sidewinder came off the rail, tracked true, and struck the Mirage. The Argentine aircraft, carrying the identity I-015, was destroyed. Its pilot ejected into the cold sky over the islands. In that single instant, the argument that had raged in London for 16 years was settled over the ocean. The subsonic jump jet had met the supersonic fighter in real combat, on the fighter's own chosen ground, and the subsonic jump jet had won. It was not the only kill of that first day, and what followed shows just how thin the Argentine margins had become. Steve Thomas engaged the second Mirage and damaged it badly with a missile. That aircraft, streaming fuel and unable to reach the mainland, tried to divert to the airstrip at Port Stanley, where in the smoke and confusion of the day it was fired on and shot down by Argentina's own anti-aircraft gunners, who took it for a British attacker. Argentina lost that Mirage twice over, first to a Sea Harrier and then to its own defences. Elsewhere that afternoon, Flight Lieutenant Bertie Penfold, another Royal Air Force pilot serving with the Fleet Air Arm, fired a Sidewinder into a Dagger and destroyed it. Lieutenant Alan Curtis shot down an Argentine Canberra bomber. When the sun went down on the 1st of May, the Sea Harriers had claimed several aircraft and lost none. And they had done it in exactly the way the theory predicted, with the all-aspect missile, the disciplined intercept, and an enemy who could not afford to stay and fight. The consequences of that first afternoon reached far beyond the score, and this is where the war was truly decided. The Argentine High Command absorbed a brutal lesson. Their best fighters, the Mirage 3s, had gone up to win air superiority and had come home battered, having lost aircraft and gained nothing, and the shock of the Black Buck raid was working on their minds. Fearful of a British attack on their home bases, and having learned that their finest fighters could not simply brush the Sea Harriers aside, the Argentine command pulled the Mirage 3s back to defend the mainland and largely withdrew them from the fight over the islands. In one stroke, Argentina conceded the contest for air superiority. From that point on, the air war over the Falklands would be fought mostly by Argentine attack aircraft, the Skyhawks and the Daggers, trying to slip past the Sea Harrier patrols to reach the ships, rather than by fighters trying to sweep the Harriers from the sky. The Sea Harrier had not just won an engagement, it had, in a single afternoon, changed the whole strategic shape of the war, and it had done so by proving that the one thing the Argentines most needed to do, beat the British fighters in the air, could not be done. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not one dramatic reversal, but a steady, grinding demonstration of the same arithmetic, repeated until the outcome was beyond dispute. The Argentine strike aircraft kept coming, pressed home by pilots who would not stop even as the odds turned hard against them. The Sea Harrier's record was not won against a broken enemy. It was earned against a determined and lethal one, right to the very end. The stakes over San Carlos water in those days can hardly be overstated. An amphibious landing is among the most vulnerable operations in all of warfare, and for the crucial hours while troops and stores were being put ashore, the ships lay almost motionless in confined water, hemmed in by hills unable to run, offering the Argentine pilots the target of a lifetime. If the Argentines could shatter the landing, the entire campaign to retake the islands would collapse before it had properly begun. The Sea Harriers could not intercept every raider that came screaming over the hills, and the escorting warships paid a bitter price in those waters. But the fighters broke up attack after attack, forced Argentine pilots to jettison their bombs early, or to press in so recklessly low that the bombs had no time to arm. And above all, they helped keep the enemy off the vessels carrying the assault troops themselves. The beachhead held. The men and their equipment got ashore. And once British soldiers were firmly established on the ground, the slow, cold, grinding advance across East Falkland toward Port Stanley could begin, the advance that would end in the middle of June with the surrender of the entire Argentine garrison. The kills mounted through May and into June. On the 21st of May, as the landings began and the Argentine attacks reached their peak, the Sea Harriers had one of their busiest days, tearing into the waves of Skyhawks and daggers, running the gauntlet of Falkland Sound and downing a string of them. Over the following days the tally climbed steadily, one intercept at a time, the all-aspect Sidewinder doing its work over and over against attackers who had no fuel to fight back. Running through the whole campaign was the figure of Commander Nigel Ward, known throughout the Fleet Air Arm as Sharky, the commanding officer of 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard Invincible, and perhaps the fiercest believer the aircraft ever had. Ward had spent years insisting that the Sea Harrier was a far more capable fighter than its critics allowed, and in the South Atlantic he set out to prove it. He flew constantly, more than 60 sorties over the course of the campaign, by day and by night, and he personally claimed 3 kills that between them captured the astonishing range of what the aircraft could destroy. On the 21st of May, providing cover for the landings, he shot down a propeller-driven Pucara over the islands using nothing but his cannon, and later that same day he and his wingman destroyed 3 Argentine daggers in an engagement that lasted barely a minute. Then, on the 1st of June, he caught a 4-engined C-130 Hercules transport flying low over the sea and brought the huge aircraft down with a Sidewinder and a follow-up burst of gunfire. The single most successful British pilot of the war was Flight Lieutenant David Morgan of 800 Naval Air Squadron, flying from Hermes, a man they called Mog. On the 8th of June, in the terrible aftermath of the bombing at Bluff Cove, Morgan and his fellow pilot, Lieutenant Dave Smith, arrived over the scene just as Argentine Skyhawks were finishing their deadly attack on the landing ships and turning for home at Wavetop Height. In a fast, violent, low-level engagement, Morgan shot down 2 of the Skyhawks in quick succession and Smith destroyed a 3rd. It was far too late to save the men aboard Sir Galahad, and Morgan would carry what he saw that day for the rest of his life. But it was both a measure of retribution and a demonstration that the price of attacking the fleet stayed lethal right to the closing days of the war. These were, in fact, the last aerial victories of the conflict. The psychological shift over those weeks was as important as the growing tally. Argentine strike pilots came to understand that reaching the ships meant running a gauntlet of Sea Harriers armed with missiles that could kill them from any angle, and that grim knowledge shaped and steadily blunted every raid they flew. It is one thing to fly into danger. It is another to fly into it knowing the odds have turned hard against you, and to go anyway, which the Argentine pilots did, to their lasting credit and their heavy cost. The Sea Harriers were not alone in the sky for the whole war. As the campaign went on, the Royal Air Force sent a squadron of its own ground attack Harriers, the version known as the GR-3, south to reinforce the effort. These aircraft, flown by Royal Air Force pilots, took over much of the dangerous work of striking Argentine positions on the ground, freeing the Sea Harriers to concentrate on the air defense of the fleet. The GR-3s flew straight to the carriers and operated from their decks alongside the Navy jets, a further vindication of the flexibility of the whole Harrier idea, and they paid their own price in the low-level war against the guns on the islands. But it was the Sea Harrier, with its radar and its Sidewinders, that owned the air-to-air fight, and that fight was the one that decided whether the fleet lived or died. When it was over, when the Argentine garrison surrendered on the 14th of June, 1982, the full accounting could begin, and the numbers told a story that has not been equaled since. In air-to-air combat, Sea Harriers destroyed around 20 Argentine aircraft, with some detailed tallies counting a few more, and the majority of those kills, 16 of them, were achieved with the all-aspect Sidewinder. Against that, the number of Sea Harriers lost in air-to-air combat was 0. Not one Sea Harrier was shot down by an enemy aircraft in the entire war. That is the record captured in the phrase 20-0, and it deserves to be stated with precision, because precision here only makes it more remarkable. It does not mean no Sea Harriers were lost at all. 6 Sea Harriers were lost during the campaign. 2 were brought down by fire from the ground from Argentine air defenses on the islands. 4 were lost to accidents and to the brutal flying conditions of the South Atlantic, where operating high-performance jets from small decks in foul weather with no diversion airfield carried its own relentless danger. But in the one arena where the experts had confidently predicted disaster, air combat against a modern supersonic fighter force, the Sea Harrier went through the entire war without a single loss to an enemy aircraft. The wider picture is just as striking. Argentina lost roughly 100 aircraft of all types during the war, from all causes. The Sea Harriers accounted for about 20 of those in air combat. The rest fell to the ship's own missile systems, to the missiles and guns of the forces ashore, and to accidents. A force that began with 20 jets and never fielded more than 28, flown by fewer than 30 combat pilots, operating from 2 carriers with no early warning and no tankers, and no friendly land base within thousands of kilometers, had faced an air arm 5 times its size, protected a fleet through weeks of determined attack, covered an opposed amphibious landing, and beaten the enemy comprehensively in the air. It ranks among the most extraordinary air-to-air records of the entire missile age. The Sea Harrier would go on to be upgraded in the 1990s into a far more capable version, with a modern radar and better missiles, and it served in the conflicts of that decade, but nothing it did afterward ever eclipsed those weeks in 1982. But records are made by people, and the cost of that record was paid in full, by both sides, and it should not be lost in the arithmetic. The first Sea Harrier pilot to die was Lieutenant Nick Taylor of 800 Naval Air Squadron. On the 4th of May, the same day the Exocet killed Sheffield, Taylor flew a low-level bombing attack against the airfield at Goose Green. Argentine anti-aircraft fire caught his aircraft and he was killed. His body was recovered by the Argentine forces on the ground, who buried him with full military honors near the airfield and marked his grave, a small and genuine act of respect between enemies that has always stood out in the record of the war, and that his family later acknowledged with gratitude. Days later, 2 more pilots, Lieutenant Commander John Ayton Jones and Lieutenant Alan Curtis, the same Curtis who had downed a Canberra on the very first day of combat, were lost together when their 2 aircraft vanished in thick cloud over the ocean, almost certainly the victims of a collision in the appalling weather. Their bodies were never found. These were not abstract losses. They were experienced men flying one of the most demanding aircraft in the world at the outer edge of what was possible, and the South Atlantic took them as surely as any missile could have. The cost on the other side was heavier still, and it too was borne by brave men. The Argentine Skyhawk pilots who died at Bluff Cove on the 8th of June, shot down as they pulled off their attack, were young officers pressing home a mission at the very limit of their range and their fuel, and they died doing exactly what their Air Force had sent them to do. Across the war, the Argentine Air Arm lost dozens of aircrew, men who flew aging aircraft carrying inferior missiles against a modern fighter, over vast stretches of hostile ocean, and who kept flying those missions long after it was plain that the odds had turned. The lopsided score was never a measure of Argentine cowardice or incompetence. It was a measure of a mismatch in equipment and geography and tactics that no amount of courage could overcome. Any honest account of the Sea Harrier's triumph has to hold both truths at once. The British aircraft was superbly employed, and the men it defeated were as brave as any who flew in that war. There is a deeper irony in the aftermath, and it concerns memory, and it is the kind of thing that makes veterans grind their teeth. The Sea Harrier proved everything its defenders had claimed and disproved everything its critics had assumed, and yet within a generation, Britain retired the aircraft and, for a period of years, gave up the very capability the Falklands had shown to be indispensable. In 2006, on grounds of cost, the Sea Harrier was withdrawn from service, and when the last of the Harriers left the fleet a few years later, the Royal Navy was left without a single fixed-wing combat aircraft that could fly from a ship. For the better part of a decade, the nation that had produced one of the most one-sided air combat records of the modern era had no carrier fighters at all. Sharkey Ward and others who had flown in 1982 spent those years arguing, with the particular frustration of men who had proven their point in combat, that the lesson of the Falklands was being quietly forgotten by the same kind of institutions that had nearly thrown the aircraft away in the first place. The habit of measuring a weapon by its cost on a spreadsheet, rather than by what it could actually do in a war, had a way of reasserting itself the moment the shooting stopped. And that brings the story to the present, because the argument that Paul Barton settled over the ocean in 1982 was never really about one aircraft. It was about a question that every military faces in every age. What do you actually measure when you decide whether a weapon is any good? The analysts who wrote off the Sea Harrier measured the things that were easy to measure. They measured top speed, and the Mirage was more than twice as fast. They measured the map, and the Argentine bases looked closer to the fight. They measured raw numbers, and the enemy fleet was 5 times larger. By every metric that fit neatly onto a chart, the subsonic jump jet was the inferior machine, and by every one of those metrics they were correct. What they could not put on the chart was the thing that actually decided the war, an all-aspect missile that made maneuver almost irrelevant, an enemy whose speed was useless because he had no fuel to spend it, and a small band of pilots trained to fight a faster opponent by flatly refusing to fight on his terms. Speed is not the same thing as lethality. The Mirage was faster, and in the end, it did not matter in the slightest. Today, the lineage continues, and the wheel has turned in a way that would have astonished the planners of 1966. The Royal Navy once again operates full-size aircraft carriers, the largest warships Britain has ever built, far bigger than the through-deck cruisers that fought the Falklands. And the fighter that flies from them is not a conventional catapult jet. It is a 5th-generation stealth aircraft that takes off in a short run and lands vertically, the direct conceptual descendant of everything the Sea Harrier proved, a vertical takeoff combat jet flying from the deck of a ship. The ski jump ramp, that elegant British improvisation, still sits at the bow of those carriers. The idea that the experts once dismissed as an embarrassing naval compromise is now the very foundation of British carrier power in the 21st century. The Falkland Islands themselves remain British, garrisoned and defended, with modern fighters based at a large purpose-built airfield constructed after the war, built precisely so that the islands could never again be seized before help could arrive. Argentina's once formidable air force, by contrast, has declined sharply in the decades since, its supersonic fighters long retired without modern replacement. The balance the war decided has, if anything, only hardened with time. Which returns us, at the last, to a single pilot in the cockpit of an aircraft his own country had signed away at the instant the tone sounded in his ears. It would be easy, all these years later, to make Paul Barton into a symbol, the tidy proof that the doubters had been wrong the whole time. He was nothing so tidy in the moment. He was a man with seconds to act, a fleet of ships and thousands of lives somewhere below him, and one missile on the rail. He did not fire it to settle a 16-year quarrel in Whitehall. He fired it because a fighter was closing on the ships he had been sent to guard, and the machine beneath him, unwanted, disguised, and very nearly sold off, was the one thing in the sky able to stop it. That is the strange truth at the center of the whole story. The weapon that saved the British fleet in the South Atlantic was the weapon Britain had tried hardest to be rid of. It was killed off in its supersonic form, then hidden inside cruisers that were not allowed to be called carriers, then handed to another navy with the ink barely dry when the war that would need it arrived. It went south almost by chance, and it came home having done what nothing else in the fleet could have done. The men who flew it did not argue the case in a committee room. They proved it in the air, in the worst weather on Earth, against odds that should have buried them, and the proof they left behind has never once had to be corrected.